In this video, I will consider the Slack Events API. Like the Slack Web API, this is another way to interact with Slack Workspace. But unlike Web API, where we ask Slack platform to do something in user's workspace or provide some information about it, with Event API, we listen to and process events coming from integrated workspace. To use the Slack Event API, your app must be integrated with Slack. You can learn how to do this from my previous video, integrating web app with Slack. The first thing you need to do is enable event subscriptions on your app settings page. Just turn this toggle on. You will also need to enter your endpoint here to handle incoming Slack events. In common case, this will be part of your web app backend API. In this section, you need to select which events you want to subscribe to. The app uninstalled event is important to me because I want to know if the user has removed my application from their workspace. And if so, then I need to remove the old access token from my database. I used events app home opened and member left channel, for example only. When we subscribe to events, we need to remember that they may require additional permission scopes for the Slack app. App uninstalled and app home opened events don't need any special scopes, and for member left channel, channel thread and group thread are required. Events API and Web API use the same OAuth permission scoping system. So in my case, I already have both the required scopes in the list of requested scopes which I use for the OAuth path to install the application. Let's take a look at the big picture of the Slack Events API workflow. My web app is integrated with Slack using the Slack app installed in the workspace. When an event which my app subscribed to occurred in the workspace, the Slack platform performs HTTP request and passes the event data to my API endpoint. On the backend, I handle events depending on the event type. The idea of an HTTPS endpoint to receive events seems pretty simple. But the first problem you may encounter is that this endpoint must be globally accessible and have a valid SSL certificate. In my case, the project deployed locally and I cannot expose a real secure endpoint for Slack events. To solve this problem, I use the ngrok platform as a reverse proxy. Instead of interacting directly with my local server, Slack sends post requests with events to the dedicated ngrok domain. The platform resends those requests to ngrok agent running in my web app environment. The agent makes the appropriate local API calls, just like Slack would. I'm thinking of making a separate video about ngrok with Node. Leave a comment if you are interested in watching it. To use the event request URL, it has to be verified first. To do this, Slack sends a verification post request which looks like this. Your endpoint has to respond with a challenge parameter and 200 OK status. This is my entry point for incoming events post requests, and I use here middleware that serves two purposes. The first is handling initial verification requests so that Slack has confidence in that endpoint. For requests with type URL check, I send back the parameter challenge and 200 OK HTTP status. The second purpose of this middleware is to check each request to make sure it actually came from Slack. We need this to prevent certain types of attacks on our infrastructure. For verification, we take the signature and timestamp values from the request headers. Next, convert the request body to a string. Then concatenate with 0 the timestamp from the headers and the body string. The result string must be hashed with a crypto function using sign-in secret from app-basic-info, and the result should be identical to what we have in the header signature. And if so, pass through the request to the controller. Otherwise, reject the request with an error. To make all this work, you need to have crypto and form URL encoded packages in your dependencies. Here is what an event object looks like normally. And here is how I represent events in my project using TypeScript interfaces. I have 3 event types, and you can see that my models are much lighter than in the documentation. This is because I only added the fields that I need in my code. App uninstalled Slack event has only one property type and is actually exactly the same as base type Slack event, but I added it here for formality. The DTO object represents the part of the request body model which I am interested in. The event object itself and the team ID, which allows events to be associated with a Slack workspace. The main event processing logic is housed in the Slack event received use case class. I support 3 types of events, and for each of them there is a switch case block. For all other types I'm throwing the error Slack event type not supported and 400 bad request status. The most important event for my practical case is app uninstalled, as this means that I can no longer use this access token issued for the workspace and I need to remove it from my database. For the other 2 events I simply log type-specific information. Also remember to send a 200 OK response in case of successful request. This is part of the Slack requirements to make sure everything is fine with the endpoint. As I said before, to use the Slack Event API, your web app must be integrated with Slack. I described how to do this in my previous video, integrating web apps with Slack. I also recommend to you watch my video using the Slack API with Node.js, if you haven't done so yet. If you are interested in continuing this Slack video series, please don't forget about the LSBC YouTube button. Like, subscribe, bell, comments.